And we are up and running, hopefully, here. And as soon as somebody joins me in the chat room, maybe I'll find out whether or not the audio on the video I just started is listenable or if I'm sounding like Rocky Raccoon. So anyway, welcome for another evening of a discussion of A Course in Miracles. And we are looking at both the text and the daily lessons. And so in order to get a clear understanding of what the progression is that we have been working on with the lesson, we're attempting to completely disengage from all of our old prejudices and our outworn belief systems. And that in itself is a pretty worthy effort. It essentially allows us to operate on the level of absolute independence because we are no longer conditioned by the past or living in expectation of the future. And so I see a couple of people have shown up here, and would somebody please let me know if the audio is coming through loud and clear, or am I sounding like a squirrel being run through a blender? Anyway, Devin is here with me. That's cool. Thank you, Devin. How are you? And anyway, I guess the next spot that we're going to be looking at is Lesson 24. This is day 24 in January. And so we are going to be doing a little bit, oh good, thank you, Maria. We're going to be doing a little bit of a review because a couple of lessons back, we had some very important ideas that were being presented to us. So if we go back to yesterday's lesson, workbook lesson number 23, it gives us an avenue for, again, that next level of empowerment that the Course is always presenting to us. Because that's the one beautiful thing about A Course in Miracles, is that it is the most empowering theme or pathway that we can embrace, because what it does is it liberates us from all of the things that we believe can harm us or hold us back from life. So yesterday's lesson said, I can escape from the world I see by giving up attack thoughts. And that's an interesting concept here, because how often do you find yourself in a defensive posture inside your head? The guy cuts you off in traffic and you go into a rage, and somebody does something at work and you end up feeling insecure, feeling like you need to look over your shoulder and protect yourself. And that's because we are inclined to always be on the attack, and because we are manifesting the things that we are constantly thinking about, then it's only natural that all of our attack thoughts are going to turn into kind of a nightmarish situation, because what's going to happen is it's going to attract those experiences into our lives. So the idea for yesterday contains the only way out of fear that will ever succeed. Nothing else will work. Everything else is meaningless. But this way cannot fail. Every thought you have makes up some segment of the world you see. It is your thoughts, then, that we must work with if your perception of the world is to be changed. The cause of the world you see is attack thoughts. You must learn that it is these thoughts which you do not want. There is no point in lamenting the world. There is no point in trying to change the world. It is incapable of change because it is merely an effect. So the world that you inhabit is an outpicturing of what's going on inside that constant internal dialogue. And that's why it's very, very important for us to strive to attain a place where we are free of our thinking, even if it's for a brief couple of seconds, 2 or 3 times a day. If we can enter into that space where we cease to be thinking, all of a sudden the slate is cleared. It's like this giant eraser just takes out all of the agitation, the fear, the bizarre imagery that we are always cooking up in our mind's eye. The world you see is a vengeful world, and everything in it is a symbol of vengeance. And that really is true if you stop and think about it. It's what this world calls justice is really a form of revenge. And, a prime example of how to transcend that is given to us by the Master Jesus. This is a guy that is being crucified, and his statement to the crowd, to the world, is, "Forgive them, Father. They know not what they do." So he was so completely in a state of disconnect from his physical body as far as his identity, that no matter what happened to his body, it really did not have any effect on him. And that's what we ultimately are hoping to attain, being in that state of absolute non-corporeal perfection, where we are not vulnerable on any level of life. So when we finally do attain that, and all of us eventually will in this lifetime or some lifetime, once we attain that level of awakened awareness, what happens is we become the master of every circumstance we encounter. And our mastery is based on the fact that we don't react to it. We don't strike back when those around us strike out at us. And we are living in a state of serenity at all times. And that's really the desirable place to arrive at. So yesterday's lesson is really an important catalyst in getting us up to this next thought, which is today's lesson. And in today's lesson, we are told, "I do not perceive my own best interests." In no situation that arises do you realize the outcome that would make you happy. And that's because, again, we're listening to the ego all the time. The ego is always telling us, "Oh, as soon as you get that new car, you're going to be happy. As soon as you get that, that break at the ice cream parlor, you're going to be happy. As soon as you get that new girlfriend or boyfriend, you're going to be happy." And so we're always chasing something, but we're never resting in a space of being at peace and being just happy, just enjoying life as it unfolds. Therefore, you have no guide to appropriate action and no way of judging the result. What you do is determined by your perception of the situation, and that perception is wrong. So that's pretty, setting the level, setting the bar, pretty much stating that everything that you think you want is something that on the deepest level is not going to reward you. So even if you're thinking, "I want enlightenment," here's where the paradox comes in. Basically, just that thought in and to itself is a negation of the fact that you already are enlightened. So it's kind of fun to run around the bush with all these different concepts that the Course presents to us, because it does help us come into the moment. It does help us step out of the identity crisis that we have created by having created the ego. If you realize that you do not perceive your own best interests, you could be taught what they are. But in the presence of your conviction that you do know what they are, you cannot learn. So this is a very humbling part of this lesson. We have to be willing to step out of our attachment to the ego and to no longer be invested in what the ego is trying to promote and trying to get us rallied toward. The idea for today is a step toward opening your mind so that learning can begin. So we're 24 days into the lessons, And we are really amping things up here with this idea of trashing all of the old beliefs, trashing all of the old thought systems, and stepping into a whole new paradigm as to what life and reality actually are. The exercises for today require much more honesty than you're accustomed to using. A few subjects, honestly and carefully considered in each of the 5 practice periods, which should be undertaken today, will be more helpful than a more cursory examination of a large number. 2 minutes are suggested for each of the mind-searching periods which the exercises involve. So, and the actual exercise, the content of it is, in the situation involving blank, I would like blank to happen and blank to happen. So in the situation involving my having not eaten in 4 hours, I would like to have something appear that I can enjoy, that I can feed myself, and thereby relieve myself of this sense of hunger. So, you know, we really have to look at what our motivations are and start to withdraw our investment in all of these different false desires that keep us, you know, like the little squirrel in the cage, running around and round and round. So, and as we move forward, the lesson for tomorrow is I do not know what anything is for. And that is another good lesson as far as disentangling us from this preconception that we understand the world we inhabit and we know what everything is for and we know our place in the universe. We have to be willing to let go of those ideas in order for a fresh start of reality to begin to emerge in our consciousness. So that's looking at, you know, the last couple of lessons and getting anchored in that that rhythm of what's going on with the lessons. So I do encourage you to seriously consider picking up the lessons from A Course in Miracles and giving them a spin. I think within the first 6 weeks you'll discover that not only have you developed a greater sense of security and a greater sense of being at peace and being at ease in all of the different conditions in your life, but I think you'll also begin to realize that you are not a victim. And that is the most important part of the journey, is that the ego promotes victimhood. So the first thing that happens when we start to undo the ego is we step out of that realm of identifying ourselves with all the circumstances and experiences that can make us a victim, that can support that idea of victimhood. So then going to the text, and we are advancing quite nicely here with the text also. We're looking at chapter 4 and examining the illusions of the ego. And in section 2, the ego and false autonomy, we're beginning to contemplate the idea that the ego gives us this assurance that our separation from each other and from God and from the world we're inhabiting is our source of security and is our source of continuity in our life, is the most desirable thing we can attain. So it constantly is trying to reinforce this idea of polarization. And the more you buy into that idea, that you need to be you need to be free, you need to be separate, and most fundamentally separate from God, then you're buying into a thought system that is going to lead you into a wilderness where there really isn't going to be an awful lot of fulfillment just in the day-to-day activity of living. So it can be very grim when you really start looking at landscape that the ego is trying to seduce you with. So I'm going to take us down here to the third section of, or the third paragraph of section 2. And it says, your own state of mind is a good example of how the ego was made. When you threw knowledge away, it is as if you never had it. So within this, we're being reminded that all of this is stuff that we've just decided to exclude from our thinking life. And you look at the idea of a conscious and subconscious mind. Why would there be a subconscious mind? Why would there be a whole region of our thinking that we don't want to address, that we don't want to live with on an hour by hour, minute by minute, day by day basis? Well, that hidden realm, part of that hidden realm, where the superconscious or the Christ consciousness is in residence, knows that in truth we never were separated from God, because that simply couldn't happen. But in our ego state, we're definitely all about this idea of individuality. It says, this is so apparent that one need only recognize it to see that it does happen. If this occurs in the present, why is it surprising that it occurred in the past? Surprise is a reasonable response to the unfamiliar, though hardly to something that occurs with each persistence. But do not forget that the mind need not work that way, even though it does work that way now. So we are creating an illusion of separateness and individuality and perpetuating it by falling for this idea that the ego is presenting to us, which is that we are in fact autonomous beings. And one of my favorite lines by Jesus was, God is life. And you find that throughout a lot of sacred scripture from all regions of the world. So if God is life itself, you could not exist separate from God, because God would be the life that is your existence. And that's where we come into those ideas of non-duality, which is where we're eventually going to end up. We're eventually going to arrive at a place where we begin to approach the idea that we and God are so closely united, are so inseparable, that we cannot be distinguished one from the other. And just think about that. The ego offers you fight or flight, run and hide, protect the body, worry about this, be afraid of that. And the truth is that our divinity, that God offers us, as Jesus told us, life and life more abundant. So all of the things that we thought we needed, as we begin to step away from that attachment to them and surrender that addiction to our physicality, the more we begin to realize that we are invincible, that we are invulnerable, that we are the crown of creation, and that there is nothing that exists anywhere in the universe that has any level of threat in our direction. So this next section is one of my favorites here in this particular chapter, because it is so lucid. I love lucid thinking, and this is a good one. Think of the love animals have for their offspring and the need they feel to protect them. No one dismisses something he considers part of himself. So, your children, the puppies that your dog has, the kittens that your cat has, all of these projections, all of these ideas of expressing yourself in a creative way are something that you're very devoted to. And that also is true of the ego that you have created, the identity. that you have created of yourself. It says, you react to your ego much as God does to his creations, with love, protection, and charity. Your reactions to the self you made are not surprising. In fact, they resemble in many ways how you will one day react to your real creations, which are as timeless as you are. And that's an interesting idea. What is our real creations? What are our real creations? Well, if we follow the line of thought that God, in the process of creating us, knew himself to be perfection, and so he expressed that perfection. In other words, he recreated himself, and that is who we are. We are God's recreation of itself. And when we arrive back at an elevated state of consciousness, we'll realize that that in truth is our greatest joy, our greatest attainment as spiritual beings, is to continue to express the idea of God into infinity. So that's what creationism really actually is reduced down to. You know, you look in Genesis in the Bible, and we are told that man was created in the image and likeness of God. So one of two things has to work out with that line of thinking. Either God is a corporeal being stumbling around on the planet, a little mud man, vulnerable to sneezes and sniffles and cancer and wars and plagues and famine, or else God is a total spiritual being. And where do you want your identity to reside? With that crippled, hobbled, physical being that eventually is going to get crumpled somehow, some way by the forces of nature? Or are you an eternal spiritual being who happens to be driving around in a human body, you know, kind of like having an automobile? It's like, this is not you, but you need to be very awake to that reality. The more you identify with your body, the more you are entangled with your own limitation. So that's what we're doing with the Course in Miracles. We're moving beyond our own self-imposed restrictions and limitations. It says, the question is not how you respond to the ego, but what you believe you are. Belief is an ego function. And as long as your origin is open to belief, you are regarding it from an ego viewpoint. When teaching is no longer necessary, you will merely know God. Belief that there is another way of perceiving is the loftiest idea of which the ego thinking is capable. That is because it contains a hint of recognition that the ego is not the self. So ultimately, we're going to step into a place where we recognize that we are God, but not in this sense of being attached to our ego. And once you start to approach that plateau of thought, then all of a sudden that thought is extended to everybody around you and every living thing around you. So you begin to see the presence and activity of God in all the people in your circles, and you begin to see it in all the different variations of the expression of life around you. You know, the trees, the grasses, the animals, the fish, the reptiles, the insects, everything becomes part of this joyous living expression. And the core of that expression is love. You know, love is a very powerful force. It is the force that unifies us, and it is the force that perpetuates us. Love is commitment. You know, God's love for us is the ultimate commitment. is basically God has reinforced that idea over and over again through thousands of teachers over the millennia, that God will never abandon us. Now, we can run away from hide from God and go through literal hell, but at some point you're going to have to break down. You're going to have to let go of that ego. And as you begin to open yourself up to the truth of your identity, all of a sudden you are lifted up to a state of consciousness that you cannot even really conceive of in this current set of circumstances that you are surrounded by. So we've got about 4 minutes left here. We'll finish up some of these thoughts. And it says, undermining the ego's thought system must be perceived as painful, even though it is anything but true. And that is one hang-up that we do have, is that we have this inclination to project a belief or an idea into our physical circumstances, into our surroundings and experiences with each other on the planet. And the thing that is the most difficult that I have discovered, and I think 99% of the people that approach this thought will discover, is that the ego is the one thing that you so cherish and you are so committed to. You are so of the belief that it is real and it is you, that it is very, very, very difficult to get to a point where you can detach from the ego. And if you're wondering, well, how do I detach from the ego? It's quite simple. The ego is the thinker. So if you can take yourself into a state of serenity, if you can take yourself into a state of atonement, at oneness with the divine, you'll discover that there is a separate you that you're oblivious to because you're so entrenched in the ego. That is the witness. It is the beingness. It is the state of all beingness. And that's your true identity. So when you can stop the mind from the constant chatter, all of a sudden you are overwhelmed by the truth of your own identity. It's an amazing process. It's an amazing journey. And it's not one to be lightly undertaken, because it takes a huge amount of commitment to clear the way, to get to the point where you are no longer living in such a state of fear of a loss of self. Oh my God, if I get to that point and I just blank out, there's no more me left. Well, that's really the purpose. Because that me that you're clinging to is the one thing that is holding you back from the ultimate expression of life on every level. So continue to work with the course. I'll be back in 1 week, and we will pick up where we left off today. We'll be looking at some of the lessons in the 30 range, lessons 33, 34, 35, in that range. And I do encourage you to spend some time with the Course in Miracles. I do have a website that offers you a lot of information. So if you are curious about if you're curious about A Course in Miracles, go to www.themiraclewithin, all one word, .org, and there's a lot of resource there to work with, plus some of the other videos I do, and gives you a kind of a broader vision of what A Course in Miracles really is. So I wish you joy and peace and happiness. Get out there, move around through the world, experience it, let down your guard, be vulnerable, be accessible, and really realize that there is no power on earth that can harm you, that can in any way interfere with your capacity to experience happiness and love, unless you surrender your truth and allow that to block you from being at love and being in love and at love within your life. So get out there, share the love, pass the love around, and we will reconvene in 1 week.